Hello, today I'm reviewing Cooler Master's latest micro-atx case, the TD300 Mesh. Now the case is available in both black and white and has an MSRP of $84.99. Now, should you consider this case for your next build? Stick around to find out. On first looks, the TD300 Mesh looks like a shrunken down TD500 Mesh, which was a case I absolutely loved. I think the standout feature for that case for me was the front mesh panel. I absolutely loved the polygonal diamond cut mesh design, and it's great to see this has been continued over to the TD300 Mesh. The tempered glass side panel has light tint and can be removed by loosening the captive thumb screws, pulling the panel backwards, then tilting away from the top and lifting away. And the other side panel is removed in exactly the same way. In terms of the front I/O, we've got a power and reset button, we've got two USB 3.0 Type A ports, and a separate headphone and microphone jack. By default, the reset button is connected up to the case's ARGB hub and is used for lighting control. The front panel can be removed by simply pulling it forward. And Cooler Master are going with just mesh in the front, there's no additional dust filter behind the front panel. With the front panel removed, you can see the two pre-installed SickleFlow ARGB fans at the front. Should you prefer, you can mount two 140mm fans at the front, and it is possible to fit three 120mm fans, although these need to be installed in the inside of the case rather than the outside. The case doesn't have any additional case fans installed, but at the top you can fit up to two 120 or two 140mm fans, while at the rear it's a single 120mm fan. In terms of radiator support, you can fit either a 240 or 280mm radiator at both the top and the front. Should you prefer to go with an air cooler, the maximum height of CPU coolers supported is 166mm. In terms of motherboard support, the case will accommodate both micro-atx and mini-atx motherboards. The case has four horizontal PCI-E expansion slots. Of note, the top two are the standard type, which are removed by a screw, while the bottom two have breakaway slot covers. You shouldn't have any problem fitting your graphics card into this case, with graphics cards up to a maximum length of 344mm being supported. At the top of the case, we've got a magnetic dust filter which can simply be pulled away. One of the really cool features about this case is the top panel is removable. It's held on with two screws, and once these have been removed, the top panel can simply be lifted away, giving you great access to the case during the build. At the bottom of the case, we've got another dust filter over the power supply's intake fan. This is just a sheet of mesh held on with clips at the side. Moving into the rear compartment, it looks like all the cutouts are in sensible places, and the two main cutouts over to the right hand side of the motherboard have rubber grommets on them. The cable routing space is between 18 and 22mm. It's great to see the case comes with both a combined fan and ARGB hub, which can accommodate up to 4 PWM fans and 5 ARGB devices. You'll notice the case's reset cable is plugged into the fan hub, meaning you're going to be able to use the reset button on the front of the case to cycle through the different ARGB effects. Alternatively, you can plug the ARGB cable coming from the hub into your motherboard to allow it to sync up with your motherboard. You'll notice we've got two 2.5-inch drive mounting points behind the motherboard, and there's also an additional two mounting points on the power supply shroud in the main body of the case. It is important to note that technically, while there is four 2.5-inch drive mounting points in the case, there is only enough supplied mounts in the accessory bag to mount two drives. At the bottom left hand side, we've got a hard drive cage which can accommodate up to two 3.5-inch drives. You can change the position of the hard drive cage by shifting it either to the right or the left, or alternatively you can remove it. The power supply is going to go down at the bottom right, and the size you have for your power supply depends on where you mount the hard drive cage. With the hard drive cage mounted as far to the right as possible, you've only got 140mm for the power supply. If you go ahead and remove the hard drive cage, the space for power supplies increases up to a maximum length of 325mm. What I want to do now is give you a look at the build I put together in the case. Okay, so the build looks great, but what about the temperatures? So our 12700K idled at 34 degrees, while it reached a maximum of 77 degrees during the 10-minute IDA64 stability test. The NVIDIA 3060 Ti idled at 30 degrees, reaching a maximum of 70 degrees under load. In terms of noise, the PC idled at 38 decibels, and reached a maximum of 45 decibels under full load. So the temperatures were very acceptable, the noise levels under load were good as well, and the noise levels at idle were probably in the moderate range, although there is plenty of scope there given those idle temperatures to reduce the fans down a little bit further to reduce the idle noise. So the next thing I wanted to test was, I had two fans installed at the front, two 120s. What would happen if we added an additional 120mm fan? So the answer is, in terms of temperatures, not a lot. The only change was that our CPU idled 1 degree cooler, although that came at the cost of 1 decibel of extra noise under load. So no real difference to the temperatures. You're going to have to pay some money for an extra fan, and you're also going to have to do a bit of work, because to get 3 fans, as we said at the front, you can't have them on the outside. You're going to have to move all the fans to the inside. So there's at least 10 minutes work there on moving the fans and rerouting the cables for no benefit in terms of temperatures. So I would stick with the two 120s at the front. The next thing I wanted to look at was, in the original build, I had installed my 240mm AIO at the top as an exhaust. I wanted to see what difference it would make in terms of temperatures, noise and aesthetics if we moved it to the front. So what I did, I installed the 240mm radiator at the front set to intake, and moved the two 120mm fans to the top set to exhaust. So with our radiator at the front set to intake, our CPU temperatures came down by 3 degrees, both at idle and under load. The GPU temperatures, however, did suffer by 4 degrees, both at idle and under load. There was no change to the noise levels at idle, but there was a 2 decibel reduction in noise levels under load by having the radiator at the front. So these results were exactly what I would expect, having done lots of thermal testing in a whole variety of cases. Having your AIO as an intake is, 1, quieter than having it as exhaust, and 2, tends to give you better CPU temperatures, because you're getting cool air from outside the case going through the radiator rather than hot air from inside the case, which is going to give you better cooling potential in terms of your CPU. In general, however, the downside of this is that all your other components in the case heat up, because you're bringing more hot air into the case, rather than when you have your AIO at the top, you're exhausting the hot air outside the case. So it's no surprise our GPU temperatures went up. So in general, having the radiator at the front set to intake, our temperatures overall were worse, although our PC was slightly quieter under load. The big problem for me though is the aesthetics. Having the radiator at the front did not look as good, particularly in terms of the extra space at the top of the case. Having the radiator at the top does a great job of hiding all the cables running down to the motherboard, and it just does not look as good when you bring it to the front. So you're not really getting a big benefit in terms of temperatures and noise by bringing it to the front, and you're significantly affecting the aesthetics. So for me, my recommendation would be to have your radiator at the top set to exhaust. So now I want to come on to my experience of building in the TD300 Mesh, and I have to say it was all really positive. It's a really, really easy case to build in. I think really the only challenge I thought I was going to have was with the cable extensions, because with 18 to 22mm at the back, it could be quite tight. I didn't really have any problem, I think, because I made 2 important decisions. One was the EPS cables at the top left of the motherboard. I decided to use the standard power supply cables for that, because you're not really going to see them once you've installed the radiator at the top, and mounting that cable at the back and trying to manage it is just going to add extra headache. The other decision I made was where I routed my GPU cable coming through to the main body of the case. Had I have used one of the cutouts over to the right of the motherboard, that cable was then going to be running up the back of the case. But what I actually did was bring it just through the cutout at the bottom right hand side of the motherboard. So it was coming directly from the underside of the case in the power supply compartments, meaning that it didn't have to run up the back of the case. So the only cable I had at the back of the case was our 24-pin cable, and I didn't have any trouble getting the side panel back on at the end of the build. The other thing that worked really well was the side panels. Whenever I first took them on and off, I thought they were going to be a little bit clunky, because you first of all had to loosen the thumb screws, slide them back a little bit before you could tilt them out at the top. But actually, this was really good for getting the panels back on. And I could imagine if you did have a lot of cables causing pressure, because you're able to push it in and lock it before having to use the thumb screws, it actually worked really well. In other cases I've done, you're actually having to push down on the side panel while trying to get the thumb screws in to secure it. You don't have to do this in this case, and actually the side panel design is pretty smart. The only other thing I wanted to mention was the ARGB hub, because I couldn't find an awful lot of detail in the instructions on how to control that. And it is important because they all work different ways depending on the case that you have. And some of them, you'll press the button a number of times, and on maybe the 8th press, it syncs with the motherboard. In this particular case, how it works, if you plug the ARGB cable into your motherboard, the reset button will not work at all for cycling through the ARGB effects. If you remove the ARGB cable from the motherboard, then pressing the reset button will cycle through a range of ARGB effects. So moving on to the things I liked about the TD300 Mesh, and the first is the looks, and I think a large part of that is due to the design of the front mesh panel. I absolutely loved it in the TD500 Mesh, and it's exactly the same with this case. I also thought the ARGB hub worked really well. It's great to have an ARGB and a fan hub in a smaller case where you're going to have limited headers on your motherboard. And particularly a lot of people do budget builds in a micro-ATX case. And again, those motherboards are going to have less ARGB and less fan headers. It's also really nice to be able to control the ARGB using the reset button. So for example, if your motherboard didn't have an ARGB header, you're still going to be able to control all the ARGB in the build using the reset button. I also loved the ability to take the top panel off. A lot of other cases, they have a radiator stroke fan tray that can be pulled out, and yes, that makes installing your AIO or fans at the top a little bit easier, but having the actual top panel come off gives you that advantage, plus giving you improved access for the build. And actually taking the top panel off was really straightforward, so it's a great idea. Another thing, it might seem like a small thing, is actually the screws the Cooler Master used. In a lot of other cases, you're having to get your manual out to see what screw secures the motherboard, what screw secures the power supply. In this case, Cooler Master have used the same screws for securing the motherboard and securing your power supply. So if you're a new builder, it's definitely going to be easier building in this case rather than having to work out what screw goes where. So moving on to things I didn't like about the TD300 Mesh, and there is just one, and that was Cooler Master's decision to use breakaway slot covers for the bottom two PCI expansion slots. You've got standard ones for the top two, and the bottom two are breakaway. I know what a lot of you are thinking, you're almost never going to need to break off those bottom two slot covers. Majority of graphics cards, even my very large Strix 3080, you're only going to need to remove the top two slot covers, so maybe that was the thinking behind it. For me, however, breakaway slot covers mean cheap case. It tends to be a lot of the budget cases you're having to break the covers off, and I don't like doing that because once you've broken them off, there's no way to put them back on again. You're going to have to get separate brackets and put them in place. I can see why Cooler Master did it because, like I say, micro-ATX case, 99.9% of people are never going to break these off. But for me, I would much prefer to have seen all the slot covers identical with the ones you remove with the screw. So putting all that together, I've been very impressed with Cooler Master's TD300 Mesh. And I think for around about £85, you're getting some pretty good value for money, and you're getting yourself a decent micro-ATX case. I think for one, it's going to look great. Two, you're getting good value for money in terms of what you're getting for your money, because you're getting two good ARGB fans pre-installed, included fan and ARGB hub with front button control on the top of the case as well. And you're going to get a lot of features that's going to make it easy to build in, particularly in terms of that removable top panel. So I think if you are in the market for a micro-ATX case, obviously there's less competition in this market. I can most definitely recommend this case, and in fact it's one of the best micro-ATX cases that I have built in. So hopefully you find this video useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. If you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.